They told me the south-facing hill was good for nothing, that the rocky slope where the creek bent was a piece of ground a sensible person would pass over without slowing down. They were right about everything except what good for nothing meant. I did not understand that on the afternoon in October of 1885, when I stood in the yard of the homestead that had been my husband's and watched his brother Ned fold the land office papers back into his coat. I held Harlan's field notebook against my ribs with both arms, the way a person holds the last thing they have. Rye sat beside my boot and did not move. The sky was the color of cold iron, and the first thin snow of the season had begun to spit out of the northwest, and I didn't yet understand that what was being taken from me was not the ground beneath my feet, but only the ground beneath someone else's rights to me. What I had not yet understood, standing there in the yard with Ned's wagon already turning, was that the hill to the south, the one everyone called a shelf of broke rock and rabbit grass, was going to be the thing that kept me alive. And not only me. If you have found yourself here and wonder why a woman would tunnel into a hillside in the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1886, stay close. Before I tell you what happened in January of 1887, let me tell you what I carried out of that yard. Ned Vance was the kind of man who carried his confidence in inherited things. He was Harlan's older brother by 11 years, and when Harlan died of a fever in September, Ned arrived 3 weeks later with papers in good order, and the papers said what Ned said they said, which was that the claim had been filed in Harlan's name alone, and that under the territorial statute, a widow without a recorded joint filing held no standing. I had a lawyer's letter in my trunk that said otherwise. Ned had a second lawyer's letter that said Ned's lawyer was right. He was not cruel about it. He stood at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told me I had 30 days and that he was sorry. And I believed that he was sorry, in the way a man is sorry when a thing he wants costs something, and that the sorriness did not change the thing he wanted. I was 34 years old. I had a wagon, a dog, a trunk of clothes, $40 in coin, and Harlan's field notebook, which Ned did not count as property worth disputing. He was not wrong to overlook it. I drove south with Rye sitting on the wagon seat beside me, his coat the dark brown of turned earth, and I did not cry until I was out of sight of the house. Then I cried until I could not see the road, and then I stopped, because Harlan had been specific on that point. He said once that grief was a weather you had to let pass through you, rather than shelter from, and that the ones who tried to live inside grief were the ones who never came out. He said it the winter we spent 2 months with Ola Halverson, the Norwegian neighbor whose claim sat 4 miles east of ours. Ole had built his house into the side of a south-facing rise 6 years before we arrived, and when the county had a bad winter, which in the Dakota Territory happened on a schedule that was simply called winter, Ole's house sat quiet and steady and warm, while the frame cabins around it burned through wood at a desperate rate and still could not keep the frost off the nailheads inside their north walls. I had been in Ole's house 3 times, twice for meals and once for a whole January night when a sudden blizzard caught us on the road, and each time I noticed what a person notices in a genuinely warm room, which is that you stop thinking about being cold. In a frame house, you do not stop thinking about being cold. You are aware of the cold as a pressure on the other side of every surface, and the stove is a small argument you are making against it, and the cold is patient in the way that large things are patient. Ole's house was not making that argument. It was simply warm, in the settled, permanent way of a spring day, and Ole himself moved through it the way a person moves through ordinary comfort rather than achieve comfort, which is to say without noticing it at all. When Harlan asked him, Ole laughed in the short way of men who have stopped being surprised by their own good sense, and he said the hill remembers summer longer than the air does. He said you dig far enough in and you find a place the cold has not yet reached, and that place becomes your floor, and the earth above your head is better insulation than any timber or plaster a man could purchase, and the south face of the slope admits the winter sun at its low angle and holds that warmth in the stone and clay of the floor, and a small fire in such a room is like a lamp in a room already lit, more comfort than necessity. Harlan wrote that down in his field notebook. He wrote down a great deal more over the next 2 days, walking the perimeter of the structure, measuring the window angles with his compass, tapping the clay walls, tracing the short run of the flue tile through the hill's surface. Ole watched with the patient interest of a man who has never had anyone want to understand what he built, rather than only comment on it. And at the end of the second day he told Harlan that the most important thing was the south face rule, that the hill had to face the sun's winter path and not the summer path, because an east or north-facing slope would give a cold, wet tunnel and nothing else. Harlan wrote the south face rule at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. He was not a formally educated man, but he had a drafter's hand when he chose to use it, and by the time we left Ole's claim he had 60 pages of penciled drawings, measurements, and observations showing the house in elevation and plan. The drawings showed the horizontal tunnel cut at a slight upward angle into the south face of the slope, so that any seepage ran out rather than pooling. The timber-framed front face with its 2 south windows set wide and low, the clay-packed walls inside, the central hearth with its short flue, and the double-door entry that made a cold trap and held the warmed interior air against the pull of each opening. He wrote that a person should dig until they find the ground the frost has not reached yet, then go 6 more feet. I had a parcel. I had filed it myself 2 years before, a separate filing on 30 acres of broken south-facing hillside that nobody wanted because it was too rocky and too steep, and too far from the creek for a frame house. The men at the land office had looked at me the way men look at a woman making an odd errand, and one of them said I could file on it if I liked, and so I did. Harlan thought it a sound hedge. He had been thinking about Ole's house for 2 years by then, and had said more than once that a south slope was what a person needed, not a flat parcel, not a creek parcel, a hill that caught the winter sun and sat with its back to the northwest wind. Harlan's brother Ned did not know about my separate filing. Nobody thought to look, because nobody thought a south-facing shelf of broke rock was worth looking for. I spent the winter of 1885 and 1886 in a rented room in Milford above the dressmakers, working days at the counter, and evenings at the kitchen table with Harlan's notebook open beside my lamp. I was not learning it for the first time. I had sat with Harlan through his readings of it often enough that much of it lived already in the back of my hands, the way a pattern lives in a seamstress's hands, not remembered by thinking, but recalled by doing. What I did in that rented room was trace the measurements until they were mine, rather than his. Until when I closed my eyes, I could walk the interior of Ole's house by memory and feel where the warmth pooled and where the floor stayed cool, and where the single window's light fell on a January afternoon. I did that until I knew not just the shape, but the principle behind the shape, which is the only inheritance that keeps working after the person who gave it is gone. In March, when the frost pulled back enough for a pick to bite, I drove out to my south-facing parcel with rye and a load of tools, and I began. The first thing Clem Pruitt said when he saw me marking the hillside in April of 1886 was that I had gone soft in the head from grief. He said it not cruelly, but with the easy confidence of a man who has never been wrong in public. Clem ran the store and the post office in Milford and had come out to check the creek level for a neighbor, and he stopped his horse at the edge of my parcel and looked at the line I had staked across the face of the slope and said, "What is that going to be, Nora?" I said it was going to be a house. He sat a moment with his hands on the saddle horn and said, "You're digging a burrow." He said it without heat, almost gently, the way a person states a fact about a small animal. He touched his hat brim and rode on. At the store the next week, when I came in for nails and lamp oil, 2 men on the porch had already heard, and one of them said he supposed the badger hole was coming along, and they did not say it to wound me, only to note it, which in some ways was harder to carry than if they had meant to sting. I did not explain myself. Harlan had been clear on that point too. He said that a thing either works or it does not, and that explaining it beforehand only gives people a larger target. So I bought my nails and drove back out to the hillside. The work was the kind that makes a body honest about what it can do. I cut into the slope with a pick and a long-handled spade, measuring the angle of ascent by Harlan's instruction, slight enough to let water drain out, but not so steep that the ceiling height dropped too fast. The soil at the face was rocky and thin, as expected for a south slope in that country, but 4 feet in it changed to a dense loam shot through with clay. And the clay was what I wanted. Clay walls do not breathe moisture in the way timber does. They hold. They accept the clay plaster later without gaps. They remember the temperature they were last plastered into and keep it longer than any wood frame can. I cut the tunnel 18 feet into the hill before I struck the depth that Harlan's notebook said to look for, which was the place where the soil temperature held steady, regardless of the surface air above. A person can find that place with a bare hand. The earth at that depth is neither warm nor cold. It is the temperature the ground will average across a year, which in that country was somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the season of your measuring. I put my palm flat on the wall at that depth one morning in May and felt it, and I went 6 more feet. Rye stayed close through the digging, lying at the mouth of the cut in the morning when the sun came flat and warm across the slope, ears up, watching the road with the particular alertness of a dog who has made himself a kind of sentinel. When neighbors rode past, which they did with some frequency once word of the digging had spread, Rye would track their horses at a slow turning of the head without rising. Most of them slowed. Some called out questions. I answered the questions about what I was doing in 1 or 2 sentences and did not answer the ones about why, because the why was not a thing I could explain in a sentence, and trying to explain it in more than a sentence was the kind of thing Harlan had warned me against. I framed the front face in rough-cut lumber over a stone-set threshold, 2 windows placed according to the angle in Harlan's notebook, low and wide, so that the winter sun at its southern declination could enter the room full rather than at a high, useless slant. The angle was precise, set by a compass bearing and a protractor I had brought from the dressmaker's supply chest, and I held the frame in place with a level borrowed from the hardware man in Milford until the windows were set and shimmed and the caulking had dried hard. From the road, what a person saw was a lumber face nailed into a hillside, low and unpainted, 2 dark windows, a plain door, and above it the ordinary slope of the hill with its grass already beginning to reknit where I had scraped back the sod. What the angle of those windows was for was not visible from the road. It would not be visible until January, when the sun came low and long and entered them like water, finding its level. Inside, I laid the floor in flat fieldstone pulled from the slope above, dry stacked and leveled, and over it a layer of tamped clay and coarse sand 6 inches thick, pounded in courses and wetted between each course to drive out the air, so that when it dried it held the day's warmth the way a hearthstone holds warmth after the fire burns to ash. The walls I plastered in clay mixed with dry grass and a small portion of wood ash, applied in 2 coats and smoothed flat, and when they dried, they were pale as old cream and slightly luminous in lamplight. The hearth I built at the back of the main chamber from dressed stone that I split and fitted by hand, using clay mortar between courses, and the flue ran as a short column of fired clay tile that I had ordered from the supply house in Milford, causing a considerable raising of eyebrows at the counter, because who ordered tile for a hole in a hillside? The tile went through the hill's surface at a low angle toward the south, so that the flue run was short, and its draft came from the hill's warmth at the base, rather than from the cold pull of a tall exposed chimney. Ole had explained this to Harlan with great specificity, because it was the detail most likely to be copied wrong. I set the capstone over the exterior tile opening and poured a ring of mortar to seal the joint, and stood back on the slope and looked at what I had built. From above, you saw only a flat stone set flush in the hillside. From the front, you saw the lumber face and the windows, the whole of it. The warmth and the principle and the labor of the summer was invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. I lit the first fire in June, a small test fire of dry cottonwood, and it burned so evenly and so quietly in the low ceiling that Rye raised his head from the floor and looked at the flame with an expression that was almost polite inquiry. Nothing dramatic came. It simply burned, drew clean, and left the room smelling of smoke and warm clay in the way that a room smells when it has been long used for exactly what it was built for. My niece, Mabel, arrived in August. She was 12 years old, her mother dead of childbed fever, her father gone west on a cattle contract that had not paid and had not written in 4 months. She came on the stage from the railhead with a carpet bag and a face that had already learned not to show what it held. And I recognized that particular face because I had worn one like it at approximately her age, which is the age at which a child decides to become the kind of person who manages rather than the kind who waits to be managed. She looked at the hillside house from the wagon seat, taking it in with a seriousness that was not pretense, and she said, "It goes into the ground." I said yes. She said, "Does it stay dry?" I said yes, if the angle is right. She climbed down from the wagon, went inside, walked the length of the main chamber with her hand trailing along the clay wall, came back out with Rye following at her heels, and said she would help with the sod work. We cut sod on the slope above and laid it over the roof timbers in 2 courses, staggered and tamped, and by September the grass had begun to re-knit, and the roof had become, to anyone looking from the road, simply more hillside. The front face with its 2 windows and the plain door was the only mark of what lived inside it, and even that face had weathered and settled to the slope's color, so that a rider at distance might pass without pausing. Mabel, standing beside me one afternoon to look at the finished work from the road, said it looked like the hill had grown a face. She said it quietly and without complaint. She meant it as what it was, that the house and the hill had become the same thing. That was what Harlan had understood and what Ole had known before him. The house was not built against the hill. It was built inside the hill's own logic, borrowing the hill's memory against the winter that was coming. The derisive label found its peak at the Harvest Social in September of 1886. Half the people of the Milford Township were there in the churchyard, long tables under the cottonwoods, and sometime in the afternoon I heard Clem Pruitt at the fence line with 3 men, telling the story of Nora's badger hole in a voice that carried the benevolent humor a successful man uses when describing the errors of a person he is not required to take seriously. I heard him say the windows were the size of a handkerchief and aimed at the dirt, and the men laughed at that, not savagely, only in the comfortable way of people hearing a story confirm what they believed. Dora Hale, who was my nearest neighbor and who had been one of the first to welcome me to the parcel, crossed the churchyard and said something quiet and direct to Clem. I could not hear the words. Clem listened with his head tilted and then said, loud enough for the row of tables to hear, that a woman was entitled to dig where she pleased. But a burrow was still a burrow, no matter how many windows you cut in the front of it. The three men agreed. Dora looked back at me across the yard, and her expression said everything that the situation did not permit her to say aloud. I shook my head at her to tell her it was all right, and she looked at me with the particular sorrow of someone who has tried to say the right thing in the wrong room. It wasn't all right. But the sod was already laid, and the floor was already stone, and the cold trap was fitted and functional, and there was nothing more to say about any of it except with the winter. If you have stayed this far, you already know something of what happened that January. But the books and the county records cannot tell you what it smelled like inside the hill when the temperature outside had fallen to 40 degrees below zero, and 7 people were breathing the same clay-walled air. It smelled like turned earth and dried grass and the smoke of a slow-burning cottonwood fire, and it smelled like the inside of a barn in winter, which is to say, like life holding itself together against the cold and the dark. December of 1886 came in cold and stayed cold. The creek froze by the first week of the month, which was 10 days early by the memory of the oldest ranchers, and the cattle on the neighboring claims were restless and pressed to the south sides of their shelters in a way the old men said they had not seen in a decade. I had laid in 12 cords of cottonwood and ash against the hillside under a board and sod lean-to, and I had put up a full root cellar of squash, dried corn, salt pork, dried beans, and a barrel of hard cider that would not freeze at the cellar's temperature. Mabel and I had chinked every gap in the front face with a mix of clay and oiled hemp fiber, working our fingers into the joints until we could feel no draft anywhere on the interior wall. I had fitted the second interior door into its frame at 6 feet inside the entry tunnel, a thick-cut plank door on heavy hinges that dropped into a clay-packed jam and made what Harlan's notebook called the cold trap, and what Ole had called, more plainly, the breathing room. The idea was simple and old. A person entering from the cold passed through one door into a short enclosed passage, closed that door behind them, stood in a column of still air while the outer cold dissipated, and then opened the second door into the warm room beyond. 2 doors meant that the warm interior air never met the full force of the exterior cold in a single opening. The heat that the hill had accumulated over weeks of slow small fires was not surrendered in a single gust each time someone came in from outside. The men at Milford, when they heard about the second door, said I must be building a jail. Clem reliably said the badger hole was getting bigger. On the 10th of January, the sky went the color of old pewter and held that color through the afternoon without changing. The wind shifted to the northwest at midday and brought with it a smell that I had learned to recognize, which was a smell like iron and ice and distance. A smell that said the storm was already old before it reached you and had been building somewhere out on the open plain for a long time. I brought rye inside. I told Mabel to fill the water barrel from the cistern, fill the lamp reservoirs, and lay the largest cottonwood round we had onto the hearth before we banked it for the night. Mabel did it without a word and without hurry, in the efficient way she had acquired from watching me work that summer and fall, which was the way you work when you have planned for the thing that is coming and do not need to rush because the preparation is already complete. January the 12th, the blizzard arrived at 4 in the morning. By the time the light came, weak and white, at 8:30, the front face of the house was drifted past the top of the north door edge, but the south windows, facing the hillside's own low slope, kept themselves clear of the main drift and took the morning light when it came, and held it on the floor the way Harlan's notebook said they would. Inside, at floor level, The mercury thermometer read 38 degrees with no fire lit. That thermometer was the one from Harlan's notebook sleeve, a thin glass tube in a pine case with a brass clip, and I trusted it because Harlan had trusted it and because it had never been wrong. 38 degrees. Not warm, but not frozen. I lit a small fire, a careful fire, not a desperate fire, a fire for warming soup and taking the edge from the air rather than for battling the outside cold. And by mid-morning, the floor thermometer read 54 degrees. Mabel was sitting at the stone table eating cold corn cake, and she looked at the thermometer and said, "It's warmer than it was in October." She meant the rented room in Milford, where we had spent the previous winter with a stove that ate wood and still let the window glass ice over on the inside. I said yes. She ate her corn cake and did not seem surprised, because Mabel by that point had lived in the hill long enough that its warmth was simply what warmth was. Outside, the county weather observer at the railway station in Milford recorded 37 below zero at his instrument box during the early hours of January the 13th. I recorded 54 above on mine. Dora Hale arrived in the afternoon of the 12th with her face wrapped in scarves to the eyes and her youngest child hauled by one arm, the child buried inside a wool coat so large it was more coat than child. Behind Dora came the Bauer family from the claim to her north, husband and wife and their hired man, all of them leaning into the wind at an angle that made them look like people pushing against a wall. I opened the outer door and the cold rushed in and they came through it into the entry passage. And I closed the outer door and opened the inner door, and they went through into the warm room. And the hired man, a tall, quiet Norwegian named Arne, stopped at the inner threshold and stood there for a moment without speaking, his head slightly lifted, feeling the warmth on his face, the way a man feels the sun when it comes out in March after a long gray stretch. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Dora unwrapped her face and said that Clem Pruitt's house was burning through wood at a terrible rate, and that his chimney was icing, and he could not keep it drawing. I said there was room for 3 more, if they needed to come. There was room, and I had planned for it, because Harlan's notebook noted that a room full of people holds its warmth better than an empty room, bodies being a heat source in themselves, and I had set the room's dimensions to hold 7 adults and provisioned accordingly. 7 of us wintered those 6 days in the hill. Rye lay against the back wall near Mabel's cot and breathed slow and even, in the way of a dog who has decided the situation is under control and his presence is sufficient. The fire burned small and steady, not roaring, not desperate. The way you burn a fire when the room is doing the work and the fire is only reminding the air of what warmth feels like. We slept in shifts on the cots and the 2 pallets I had stored in the root alcove for exactly this occasion. And we told stories and played cards and ate hot soup that Dora made as a way of being useful, because Dora was the kind of person who cannot sit idle when she is frightened, and the making of soup was the thing that kept her steady. On the 3rd day, Mabel and the Bauer boy invented a card game and argued its rules with the focused energy of children who have decided, without discussing it, that what they are doing is being fine. Outside, the county recorded 2 deaths. 2 elderly bachelor homesteaders, men who had lived alone in frame cabins for 15 and 20 years, men who had survived every previous winter on the creek by the combination of long experience and stubbornness, burned through their cordwood by the 3rd day of the freeze and could not get help and could not keep warm. The county recorded them in February when the thaw came and someone went to check. Clem Pruitt burned 11 cords of wood in 6 days and still cracked the plaster from frost on his north wall, and still sheltered only his own family of 4, and still lost 2 pigs and a milk cow to the freeze in the uninsulated barn. Inside my hill, I burned 3 cords in 6 days and sheltered 7 people and kept the floor at no lower than 38 degrees, even when the fire was banked at night, and lost nothing. On the morning of the 18th, the sky cleared and the wind fell back to nothing, and the silence it left was the particular silence of a world that has just stopped trying to kill you and has not yet decided what to do next. I opened the outer door and the cold came in hard and clean and brilliant. The kind of cold that has no malice in it now that the wind is gone, only distance. Rye put his nose out and then his whole head, and stood reading the air with his ears forward, cataloging the aftermath the way a good dog does, methodically and without alarm. I heard the crunch of footsteps coming up the frozen slope from the road. Clem Pruitt came around the shoulder of the drift that had built against the hillside, his coat whitened with frozen condensation, his beard carrying a rim of ice along the jaw. He had walked half a mile in the aftermath cold, which was still 12 below, to see what was left of the badger hole. He stopped at the door. He looked past me into the lit interior where 7 people were alive and warm, and Dora was pouring coffee into a tin cup and handing it to Arna. And the smell of the fire and the clay and the warmth rolled out through the open door and met the cold outside and made a clear line between the two. Clem stood at that line. He looked at the face of the hill, at the sod roof above, at the angle of the south windows where the January morning light fell full, and even across the fieldstone floor. He looked at the mercury thermometer on its nail beside the door, which read 49 degrees, and he looked at the thin smear of smoke at the flue cap in the hillside above, barely visible, a small, quiet breath. Then he looked at me, and his face had the expression of a man who has just finished understanding something he should have seen a long time ago. "I did not know a hill could do that," he said. He said it quietly, without drama, in the plain voice of a man who has just been corrected by evidence and has accepted the correction without argument. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that the hill had not already said more plainly than I could manage. He came inside and I gave him coffee, and he sat down near the hearth and looked at the clay walls and the dressed stone floor and the low ceiling and the angle of the morning light in the windows. And he did not speak for a long while, and the silence he kept was the most respect any of them had paid to Harlan's notebook, or to Ole Halverson's knowledge, or to my own labor in 3 years. It was a useful silence. I let it stand. Jonas Fisk came out from the land office in March of 1887 with a survey pad and a set of questions that someone at the county level had directed him to answer. Someone had heard about the Hill House and the January figures and wanted a report. Fisk sat in the kitchen chamber for 2 full afternoons with Harlan's notebook open between us, asking questions and copying measurements. At the end, he asked if he could take the notebook to the county seat. I said he could copy here, but the notebook did not leave the hill. He sat another afternoon and copied 23 pages, and he wrote in his report that the design represented a sound application of earth mass thermal storage, and that the south window angle, the double-entry cold trap, the clay interior finish, and the short interior flue were the 4 elements that together produced its performance, and that structures lacking any one of them had shown markedly inferior results. He filed the report in April. Someone at the territorial level added a note that said the design merited further study, and nobody followed up on that note for 3 years. But the report existed, which was the beginning of the method's public life. The following spring, 3 families filed claims on south-facing slopes in the township and began to dig. 2 of them came to me with their questions. They sat at the stone table with Harlan's notebook between us, and I showed them the angle calculations and the clay mix ratios and the cold trap dimensions. and I drew them the flue angle from memory because I had drawn it enough times that summer to draw it in the dark. Those two built houses that held. The third family looked at the front face of my house from the road, took their own measurements of the visible surface, and tried to copy what could be seen from outside. They got a cold, damp tunnel that smelled of mildew by October and sent them back to a frame house before Christmas. This was the thing Harlan had come home from Olds knowing, and the thing I had spent the winter of 1885 learning from his notebook, and the thing that cannot be written in a land office report in a way that fully travels. The principle is not in the visible form. The form is the record of the principle, and the principle is the thing that has to be understood before the form is copied, or the form is only a shape, and a shape does not keep you warm. The name Vance Cut appeared in Fisk's second report in 1891 in a passage about earth-sheltered structures in the northern plains, and after that it turned up in the letters of the agricultural extension agents who came through the territory in the later years, and in a survey of winter sheltering practices that a woman from the university sent out in 1903, and that I answered by post. The name was never one I used for it myself. I called it the hill, or the house, or the place, in the way that you refer to a thing whose name you do not need because you live inside it. The hill did not require a name from me. It required only that I understand it, which I had learned from Harlan, who had learned it from Ole, who had understood it from a tradition that went back long before either of them, across the cold northern reaches of the world where people had known for generations that the earth holds warmth longer than the air does, and that a hill remembers summer in its bones all the way into February. Mabel grew up in the hill and went east to teach school in Minnesota in 1893, and she wrote me letters twice a year for the rest of her life. In those letters, she sometimes mentioned the smell of clay and wood smoke as the smell of safety, which she could conjure anywhere by closing her eyes, and I was glad for that. The thing worth inheriting is not the structure but the memory of the warmth, and the memory will travel wherever a person carries it. Rye grew old in the hill. He was 12 years old in the spring of 1894, stiff in the hips, slow on the slope, gray around the muzzle and the eyes, and he died one April morning on his blanket near the hearth in the way that good dogs die, which is quietly and without complaint, still warm. I buried him in the slope above the roof, in the earth where he had spent his winters sleeping, and I tamped the sod back over the place, and the grass re-knit, and by the following summer you could not have found the spot without knowing where to look. A stranger walking the hillside would have seen only the hill. That felt correct to me. He was part of what the hill held, and the hill was the right place for him. His successor was a brown bitch Mabel sent from Minnesota with a note tied to her collar that said her name was mine to decide. I named her South for the slope she would live on. South had the same quality Rye had, the quality of watchful calm, of understanding that most danger can be observed and measured and survived without rushing, which is also the quality the hill had, which is also what Harlan had been trying to teach me through Ole's house and the field notebook and every conversation we had in those years. He had been teaching me to be the kind of person who does not panic, the kind who measures, the kind who builds for the winter before the winter arrives and does not explain themselves while they do it, because the thing either works or it does not. Jonas Fisk retired from the land office in 1909 and spent a winter writing down what he remembered of his years in the territory, and he gave 3 pages of his memoir to the Earth House Method and to the January of 1887, and in those pages he wrote about the design with a precision and a respect that surprised me when he sent the pages by post, because Fisk had always struck me as a man who documented things faithfully without quite believing in them. But he wrote that in 30 years of land assessment in the northern plains, he had encountered no form of shelter better suited to the extremes of the climate, and that the Vance Cut, as it had come to be called, represented one of the clearest examples he knew of knowledge surviving its maker, traveling through the hands of the people who had learned it directly, and outlasting the names of most of the people who had ever argued against it. I read those pages sitting on the stone floor of the hill, with the south light coming through the windows at its low winter angle, warm on my hands and the floor warm under me, and the hill quiet above. Outside, it was February, and the temperature was 20 below, and the hill did not notice. It held its warmth the way it always had, from the inside out, from the deep, slow memory of the earth that the frost had not yet reached, and had never reached in all the years I'd lived inside it. Harlan's notebook was already in the County Historical Society's glass case by then. I had sent it in 1918 when they wrote to ask, because the notebook was the record, and I was the knowledge, and the knowledge was the thing that had to keep moving. The south windows still hold the winter sun. The floor is still the same stone. The hill does not need my opinion of what it is. It simply holds,